Before UFC 94, Dana White stated, "We're looking for guys who want to work with us and not against us, and I'm frankly just sick of this." It's not even funny. Fitch is still out there trying to build his company. Let Fitch go work for them. Let him see what he thinks of those. These guys are not partners. All of them. Every last one of them. As you see, Dana White was super pissed off that the bulk of fighters at AKA did not want to sign this lifetime contract, and again this caused a big uproar in the MMA community to such a point that the head honchos over at the UFC, Dana White's best friends, the Fertitta brothers, Lorenzo, to be exact, stepped in and had a sit-down with John Fitch and Dana White and had everything worked out. Not exactly sure what took place during that meeting, but all I know is John Fitch was reinstated back into the UFC, and he confirmed that he signed the UFC contract for his likeness to be in the UFC video game. And Dana White apologized about the situation and said he jumped the gun, etc. But this moment was another case of Dana White being very hot-tempered and not really thinking things through and just reacting out of emotion. Now let's take it all the way back to the beginning when the Fertitta brothers bought the UFC. This is one of Dana's earliest beefs with any fighter on the roster, and it was with the legendary Frank Shamrock. When the Fertittas bought the UFC, they were trying to get it on the mainstream market, so they asked Frank Shamrock to come in to be a consultant, to help them with the promo and the marketing, and coming up with different ideas. According to Frank Shamrock, they presented an idea to him during a meeting, and he didn't agree with where they wanted to take the UFC, and according to him, that pissed Dana White off. Because of this, Frank Shamrock decided not to re-sign with the UFC and instead went to fight over in K1, and by leaving the UFC and not re-signing, that created nearly 20-plus years of beef between Frank Shamrock and Dana White. Throughout the years, Dana White has taken jabs at Frank Shamrock, and Frank Shamrock has done the same. Out of every promoter in combat sports history, Dana White has to be the most controversial. Over the decades, he has had multiple issues with different fighters on the UFC roster. When it comes to managing and running a company, it's expected that an employer or promoter will have disagreements with employees from time to time. But with Dana, it's not just a disagreement. It turns into public bashing, name-calling, and sometimes blatant disrespect. In this video, we're going to discuss some of the issues he has had with fighters over the years. We're going to start with one you guys probably forgot about, when Dana White released and basically fired John Fitch, who at the time was a top 5 welterweight. According to John Fitch, Dana White fired him because he refused to sign over his likeness for the new UFC video game that was about to be released in 2009. At that point, every fighter had signed over their likeness, but Fitch wanted to stay in control of his brand, which is understandable. He believes that was the reason he was let go. When the news broke of John Fitch being released, the MMA community was shocked because we were talking about a top 5 welterweight who had recently headlined UFC 87 against welterweight champion Georges St-Pierre, and now suddenly he was out of a job. But John Fitch was not the only fighter from American Kickboxing Academy that got cut. Multiple other fighters were also released by the UFC, and some were still on the chopping block, including Cain Velasquez, who was on the rise at the time, and even Josh Koscheck, who was becoming a popular name. It all came down to the fact that Dana White didn't like the way AKA representatives Dwayne Zinkin and Bob Cook handled business when it came to their fighters. Like John Fitch, many fighters didn't want to sign away their rights and likenesses to the company, which was reportedly a lifetime contract. At a press conference in Hawaii, Dana made it clear he had no interest in working with those who refused to cooperate. And Dana's issue with Frank Shamrock has kept Frank Shamrock out of the UFC Hall of Fame, which is absolutely mind-blowing because Frank Shamrock helped revolutionize this sport. Now there's another UFC legend that helped revolutionize this sport that Dana White ended up having issues with, and that was the legendary Pat Miletich. According to Dana White, Pat and Carlos Newton were scheduled to be coaches on The Ultimate Fighter, and that's what was agreed to, and Dana decided to make A little switcheroo and kind of left Pat hanging, and that severed their relationship right there. Now obviously Pat had a right to be upset. You think you have a job locked in to be a coach on The Ultimate Fighter, and then out of nowhere the boss decides, hey, we're going to go with a different group of guys, and that severed relationship led to Pat Miletich not being in the UFC Hall of Fame for a long time. And out of every issue Dana White has had with any of his fighters, I think this was one of the first where he openly admitted that he was wrong, and it was absolutely his fault. But eventually at the UFC Expo, Pat was finally inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Now, one of the most recent beefs that Dana has had, and Dana has been very outspoken about this fighter, and you guys should all know who I'm talking about, and that is Francis. That is the former UFC heavyweight champion. And at one point Francis was held at this high standard. Dana praised him as one of the most exciting and one of the greatest UFC heavyweight champions ever. And all it took was for negotiations to fall apart for Dana White to kind of change up on him, and that's exactly what happened. According to Francis, during negotiations he wanted to start implementing health insurance for fighters who couldn't afford it, because at the time he was making more than enough money to pay for his own health insurance, but he knew there were other fighters out there that couldn't afford to pay for theirs. So I guess he presented this idea during the negotiations, and the UFC was not trying to hear it, and whatever money was offered to Francis, he turned it down and decided not to re-sign the contract. And when he decided not to resign that contract that moment, he became an enemy of Dana White. When it became public that he didn't resign, Dana White made it very clear it's all about Francis in the beginning, and then I found out who Francis was. When somebody shows you who they are, believe them. I have no sleepless nights over Francis leaving. I didn't like Francis as a person. Wasn't a guy I wanted to do business with. Francis isn't a good guy. There was a lot of back and forth between Francis and Dana White, and Francis hasn't fought in the UFC in a few years. That beef is still ongoing, and it doesn't look like they will ever reconcile. Now let's go on to one of Dana's biggest beefs that he has ever had with a fighter, and you guys should know who I'm talking about, and that's Tito Ortiz. Now, this one was publicized, and it's been going on for such a long time, and these guys still really hate each other. Like, they absolutely hate each other. And the crazy part about this beef is Dana and Tito were actually friends at one point. Dana used to manage Tito Ortiz. I believe there was a conflict of interest because Dana was the promoter of the UFC. Plus, he was managing Tito, so I think that was an issue. I think once they kind of split, even though it wasn't necessarily on bad terms that I'm aware of, there were a lot of unresolved issues going on there. But it seemed like as time went on, it just kept getting worse and worse. Dana claimed that the biggest issue with Tito would be that months in advance, he would agree to everything that he had to do according to that contract. But when the time came to fulfill his obligations, Tito would try to renegotiate right in the middle of it and say, hey, no, I need an extra 100,000, or I'm not showing up to do this event. And Dana said that's where his biggest issue came along with Tito Ortiz. Now, of course, Tito is going to have his side of the story. Fighter pay has always been a big thing when it came to MMA fighters in general, but specifically with UFC fighters. That's been a very big issue, that they're not being paid what they deserve to be paid. Now, I'm not exactly sure what Tito was being paid, but obviously money was a big issue, and as I stated, as time went on, their relationship just got worse and worse. It got to a point where Tito Ortiz and Dana White agreed to a boxing match, an actual boxing match. Dana White thought it would be a good idea to fight a UFC fighter in a boxing match. Of course, Tito Ortiz is not a professional boxer, but still, this is a guy that throws punches for a living. This is a guy that fights for a living. I believe Dana White did have a little bit of boxing experience as a trainer, but he still never fought professionally. And I remember they even had a whole segment on Spike TV showing Dana training, getting in shape, preparing for Tito, but then Tito ended up pulling out of the fight. And I'm quite sure you guessed why Tito pulled out of the fight. Money. According to Tito, Dana was not willing to pay him the money he asked for the boxing match, but according to Dana at the time, Dana believed Tito was scared. Now I believe. He retracted that statement some years later, saying that he knew Tito would probably hurt him. But at the time in the moment he was saying that Tito was scared of him, which we all knew wasn't true. But that situation with the whole boxing match did not help anything. All it did was further push their beef into an even worse situation. And again, like I said, to this day, Dana White still hates Tito Ortiz, and Tito Ortiz still hates Dana White. And I know everybody out there would have thought the Tito beef with Dana White would be the biggest one, but you would be wrong. And I want to tell you why. There was a beef with another superstar in the UFC that was way worse than this, that actually led to a lawsuit. And we're talking about the natural Randy Couture. Yes, Randy Couture. This beef was actually bigger than Tito's beef. This one went to new heights to the courts. That's how bad this beef got. Randy Couture is actually banned from ever showing his face at any UFC event. Now, the Randy issue is somewhat similar to a lot of other fighters when it comes to pay and branding and things like that. At one point, the UFC was looking to sign Fedor. Most MMA fans wanted to see Fedor in the UFC, and at the time, Randy Couture was the champion, and that's the fight that everybody wanted to see. So at very first fight back was against Brock Lesnar, and Randy Couture ended up losing that fight and losing the heavyweight championship. After his loss to Brock Lesnar, Randy Couture continued to fight in the UFC all the way up until 2011. So even after everything that took place, Dana and Randy Couture's relationship was somewhat reconciled. Probably not perfect. And I say that because what happens next was like the final nail in the coffin. Randy Couture signed on for a commentating deal with Fox Sports. At this time, this was when the UFC had signed that big, huge deal with Fox Sports Network. Randy Couture was brought on to be a part of that Fox TV deal, and for some reason Randy Couture pulled out and decided to sign on with Spike TV. And one of the shows was with Bellator, which was a direct rival to the UFC. That was the last straw for Dana White, and after that it's just been bad ever since. Now, Randy Couture making that decision actually hurt him in the long run, but it also hurt his son Ryan Couture. Ryan Couture had a fight coming up in the UFC that same exact year, and because of Randy's actions, Dana White banned Randy Couture from coaching his son. The UFC and I don't want him. He's not cornering him. Randy Couture can't buy a ticket to this mother. Okay, so I said, you know he's not going to be around, and I just want to be upfront with you. You know how I am. I want to be honest. I want to be upfront. If you wanted me to release you from your contract so that you could go do a deal with Bellator and have your dad in, maybe work with him, and come up and do whatever, I would do that for you too. So now Ryan Couture didn't have his father in his corner to help coach him, which didn't end up going well for him. He lost his very first fight in the UFC against Ross Pearson by TKO, and then he had one more fight in the UFC against Al Iaquinta, and he lost that fight also. So you guys can see how I say the Randy Couture beef was much bigger,